Good morning. Welcome to day 3 of the North Carolina System Conference. Going over the agenda, we're working on day 3, which the focus is on completion. I guess I have a question to Sharon Morrissey. Is it completion because we're focused on student success and graduation, or is it because we're completing this conference? I'm not sure which one it is. I want to talk to you a little bit about one of our system priorities. This year, the system's introduced multiple initiatives that really fall under this Success NC umbrella. And the initiative which I had a good fortune of playing an important role in is what we're calling the Data Initiative. The goal of this initiative is to establish a robust data system that provides accurate and accessible information, fosters a culture of data-driven decision-making, addresses research questions, and informs policies. Soon after we started planning this initiative, we knew that we needed a holistic approach that garnered the attention and engagement of faculty and staff across the state. Unfortunately, data is not sexy, or what Mark Millar would call a right thumber. And it can be difficult garnering this attention and engagement unless we can demonstrate the connection of data to student access, progression, excellence, and completion. A group of us discussed if there are professionals out there that can provide insight to draw that attention and to motivate participants within the initiative. We agreed on some key qualifications for this person. One would include have extensive experience working with higher education data, preferably at the community college level, ability to demonstrate the connection of data to student access, progression, excellence, and completion, know of how to generate a culture of curiosity and inquiry that will generate research questions, know how to utilize the answers to those questions to promote a culture of evidence-based decision-making. They would have to be charismatic, and they'd have to be stylish. I quickly informed the group that I appreciated the nomination, but thought we needed someone outside the system to validate this initiative and provide recommendations from an external perspective that would strengthen it. The group quickly assured me that they were not nominating me and recommended Rob Johnstone. Okay, I actually made some of that up, but it sounded good when I was writing it last night. But we are very fortunate to have Rob as a partner in this initiative. Rob is well known for promoting his use of evidence and inquiry to inform decision-making at all levels in the organization. As a senior research fellow at the Research Planning Group, also known as the RP Group, he manages the RP's national projects and has been working intensively on 2 major national initiatives. This includes assisting cadres of colleges in various states, including North Carolina, and the Gates Foundation Completion by Design project, which is focused on improving completion rates through a series of structural innovations and focus on completion outcomes. In addition, he serves as an evaluator of the Aspen Institute Community College Excellence competition, which 120 community colleges annually compete for a prestigious $1 million prize, recognizing outstanding academic and workforce development outcomes and improved performance over time. Even though Rob has yet to tell me why no North Carolina college has ever been an Aspen finalist. He has served as Dean of Research and Planning at Skyline College and has been a Chief Academic Officer at Foothill College, where he served as a board representative for the League of Innovation. He holds a Ph.D. in social psychology and the law from the University of Oregon, a master's in psychology from San Jose State University, and a bachelor's in psychology from Stanford University. So far in this conference, you've had the opportunity to hear Mark Millar, Michael Collins, and Sandy Shugart all highlight the importance of data and its impact on policy decisions that facilitate student success. Now you can add Rob Johnstone to that list. Please welcome Rob Johnstone.
I didn't know who my competition was for the role here for helping out North Carolina. Really happy to be here today. A great introduction by Bill. What I would add to it is that I've spent most of the last 11 years on the ground in the community college system. I worked in industry prior to that as a strategic consultant. Much of my focus that I bring to bear here combines those two things as a strategic consultant in industry and being on the ground in community colleges. Another interesting point of reference, Bill mentioned my doctorate's in social psychology with an emphasis in psychology and the law. My background in research for my dissertation was doing jury decision-making research. And I did this in the 1990s on the West Coast. Anyone think about what was going on in the 1990s jury system at that time? I literally was doing mock jury trials during the O.J. Simpson trial. At no point in history has there ever been more interest in the jury system, so none of my results are replicable. And I had to go to a different field, so now I'm in the community college world. I do this thing I call the Presentation Challenge Index to kind of rate the challenge of a presentation. And so this goes in, factors go into this, like the setup of the room, the logistics, the fact that it's 5:30 a.m. California time. But some other examples of this historically, I've also had to present, one of my least favorite times to present is over lunch. That's always a great thing when you're at a conference. You get a bunch of people together. They've been sitting around all morning not having a chance to talk. They finally get together for lunch. You give them 20 minutes to start eating, and then you bring some joker up to stop the conversations they've been wanting to have all morning and present. So that's a tough one. Those of you who know me who will also know that one of the toughest times I have presenting is during happy hour. I have actually presented during happy hour. That is not a fun time to present. If you know me or were at Raleigh Times last night, you know that I enjoy happy hour. And so presenting over that's a challenge. I've also presented the fourth morning of a conference in New Orleans at 8 a.m. So that's not good, by the way. And it was harder, the decision came about 2 o'clock for many of us on Bourbon Street, whether to actually go back to bed or not, but I did that presentation. Recently, I did a presentation in Dallas in a room not quite as big as this one, about 1,100 people, and I'm sitting there waiting to go on, and the chancellor walks over and says, no pressure, but the last person to present on this stage was President Obama. It's like, wonderful. And so then it gets worse there. They bring out their student choir to do 2 rousing numbers. So they do a number from Rent, a number from Wicked, and then I get to go talk about data. So how could that go wrong? But this is nowhere near the most challenging setup I've seen. And then luckily, this wasn't me presenting. In California, I was at a conference, and you know how often conferences are at the hotel. So this was a hotel in Orange County, and a gentleman was speaking over lunch, which was already a problem. And he was speaking on something that was annoying to everyone in the room. He was basically telling the community college people in the room that our policy lobby was about as weak as there was in California, right? So he was saying, you guys are lower than the morticians, you're lower than the bricklayers, you have no lobby, you have no power. So he's giving this speech. But what's going on at the same time is this is Southern California, and I wish I was making this up, but I'm not. Behind this guy was actually the pool of the hotel. So it's one of those conference areas by the pool. You might see where this is going. So what is going on behind him is the Miss California Fitness Pageant swimsuit competition. I kid you not. And so the good news for him is this guy was not one of the world's best speakers. So he's standing here at the podium looking down the whole time reading. And every time he looked up, I thought to myself, this is the first time this guy's ever had this much eye contact in a presentation because everyone is looking directly behind him. So this, compared to those, is not a challenge. Now, I also, on my own front, I'm looking around the stage. There's a lot of beautiful flowers and props up here. That's dangerous for me. I have fallen off a stage before during a keynote presentation. Did that once. And I also, perhaps the height of embarrassment, is I was in a presentation about 120 people in one of the breakout rooms. And my colleague was presenting, so I had moved over to the side and was standing there leaning up against the wall, watching the presentation. Turns out it wasn't a wall. It was a door into the next room. And I fell through the door, onto the ground, into the next room. And so I will give myself some credit. I did stand up, didn't miss a beat. I said, how's everyone doing in here? You guys good? All right, I'm going to go back over there now. And I went back to the presentation. So that kind of sets the stage here. So I'm very honored to be here, and what a great lineup of speakers you've had today in the last couple of days, between Mark, Michael, and Clive, and Sandy yesterday setting the stage. It's funny, I've seen Sandy speak numerous times, and I had my presentation ready to go today, and as Sandy was speaking, I was thinking to myself, he could not possibly have set up where I was going to go today better during his presentation, so serendipity or fate being what it is. What Sandy talked about a lot yesterday, for me, the thread I talked about, was this notion of a culture of inquiry. And although this sounds new agey and the next thing to come down the pike, we've been focusing on evidence-based decision making, I think you'll see in what Sandy said, and I'll refer back to it a little bit, and in what I'm going to try to talk about today, this idea that this really is a shift in our thinking. And it's one, by the way, if you look at, and as Bill mentioned, the RP group does the site visits on the Aspen Prize. We didn't write the algorithm that identified the top 120, but we do the site visits. And going to see Valencia last year and the work that they've done, a couple things stand out about their story. One is it's a 10 or 12-year story. This is not a story of transformation in 60 minutes or 6 months. They built that culture over time. I'll pepper a couple of Sandy's quotes throughout the day, but one of the things he said that was really interesting at the start, he says, I can't tell you the answers about how we did it, but I think I can tell you how we framed the questions, right? That's such a key piece of this, is how do we frame the questions? And so what we're going to do today is walk through kind of our take on a culture of inquiry, making data and evidence real for practitioners, for faculty and staff, for everyone in this room, focused on the type of questions we ask and then what we do with that data. We're going to pepper with some examples today, and then at the end I'll transition it a little into how this sets the stage for projects like Completion by Design or many others which reflect on the evidence and put together some design principles. We'll talk about that a little bit. So first of all, my group, the RP group, we're not going to spend too much time on this. This is an interesting group. It was started as the trade association for the IR folks in California. So 20 years ago, it basically was a professional association. We got together, talked about SPSS. It was great. Good times. Were had by all. And about 10 years ago, we started doing more projects when one of our leaders noticed that, there's a lot of people out there outside of our world, whether they're private consulting firms or research universities, who have no problem telling us what they think we should do. Right? Often lobbing things over the fence at us with research studies. But there's not a lot of people in the system who are based in the community college system doing this type of work. So we started doing research and evaluation work. About 5 years ago, we started doing technical assistance of the type we're doing on Completion by Design. So the key to this organization is we are all practitioners. We have 10 or 12 full-timers and about 60 practitioner consultants who come into our projects as on a needed basis, almost all of whom have day jobs in the community college system, not just IR. More importantly, it's faculty, administrators, student services professionals to combine into this idea of how do we move the needle forward using data, research, and evidence as a platform. Evidence never makes decisions for you. It serves as a foundation for you to discuss and explore. And one of the things we're going to talk a lot about today, if you take one thing away from this, it's that the data isn't enough. What you need is the time and space to actually explore that data and derive meaning from it and bring meaning to it. And we'll give you some examples of this in a minute. Just some quick acknowledgments before we get too into this is that a lot of this work is based on RP's work on Completion by Design and the Aspen Prize. I'll pepper in some examples from there. And we have a host of partners that we've been fortunate enough to work with in the last 24 to 36 months, like CCRC and Public Agenda and WestEd. And so also the infographics in here, which are pretty cool, I have nowhere near the skill set to actually put into place. So we have a very good person who does this, and you can't have him because he needs to do it for us. So let's talk a little bit about the backdrop to this, the student experience. And so we're going to look at this next slide from a couple levels. One of the things that happens a lot in our world with accountability, one thing that's different from 10 years ago is 10 years ago, how many of us really knew deeply our completion and transfer rates on our campuses or our DevEd cohort rates? So this wasn't something that we had a lot of, either didn't have the data, didn't have it in a way that was useful, didn't look at it. Today that's changed for some good and bad reasons. We could spend another hour just talking about the completion agenda that's gone on nationally. But for now, let's just say that it's an opening day ceremony on your campus, and a very well-meaning president does something like the following. They come and say, you know what, we've been looking at the data, and we've looked at our completion rates, and our completion rate is about 40%. Now, that's shelving about a 90-minute discussion of who's in the denominator of a completion rate and who's in the numerator, because I can manipulate that number, by the way, to make it 20 or 60%, depending on decisions we make. But for the sake of argument, we'll say we have a number we like. It's about 40%, and the president says, you know what, our completion rate's 40%. Our initiative is in the next 3 years, we're going to make that 50%. Sounds reasonable. Sounds like a good idea. Everyone in the room nods, get fired up a little bit, and then they go back to their office. And if they're like me, they go back to, I was a psychology instructor, I'd go back to my office, I'd close the door and say, what the hell is my role in actually moving our completion rate from 40 to 50%? That sounds good in theory. But the problem with data points like completion rates is they exist at a 30,000-foot level. They're not very useful to the average practitioner. Vitally important rate in the end, but they're not very useful to those of us who live and work on the ground. So one thing we can do is start breaking out, as Sandy would say yesterday, focusing on completion is focusing on the end of it. What are the component parts of completion? And so we start breaking it up. We could take a look at first-time students and their completion rates. We could maybe look at the thing like the presence of a learning community. By the way, we know, we've seen the research on learning communities. Learning community is a term that's now come to mean about 300 things. But there's good research on the effect of learning communities. We could start breaking it down into that. We could look at some other things that have been shown to be related to student success. And as we're doing this, we're unpacking the nature of completion down to its component levels. But if you take a look at this from the student standpoint for a second, what their world looks like, something a little more like this. A pathway that doesn't have much going on in terms of structure, doesn't have much going on in terms of being in sync, but there's a lot of individual events that define their world. Whether it's meeting with an outreach, taking the assessment test without adequate preparation. You ever listen to the focus groups that you do? Seen the focus groups done with people who just took the placement test? Pretty fascinating stuff. 5 years ago, before we started making some changes, if you asked the people when they came out of the placement tests what they thought about the process and the placement test, they had no idea how important this was. Absolutely no clue how important this single event was, which until recently was the only event that actually determined how long they were going to be with us. It's the best predictor of their time with us, and the lower they tested, by the way, the lower the graduation rates for a number of reasons. So the point of this slide is twofold. One is that the world is chaotic for our students. One of our math faculty in California, who was a state academic senate president, looked at this and said, "That's great, Rob, but it's still linear." And the student's pathway with us is in no way linear. It circles back on itself. We tried to get our graphics guy on that, but it actually looks like a Rorschach test when you do that. But the point of this from an inquiry standpoint is that we can't often try to change this number. What we need to look at are the component pieces that we have more of an ability to change, which happen more on the ground level. There's an entirely different use of this slide for completion by design, which is that structure and taking a more intentional approach to how we manage the student experience is incredibly important. We'll come back to that. But this is a backdrop for the work. So let's talk a little bit about culture of inquiry. What goes into this mythical culture of inquiry? And this is just one of many definitions, but ours, I think the key to it are two words in here, and that's dialogue and outcomes. The idea that we actually need to have dialogue about the evidence and explore it, and we're focused on strengthening the institution and the outcomes of its students. That sounds trivial, but we'll come back to this too. I don't know that actually much of the stuff we do focuses on the outcomes of the students when we talk about research and evidence. Some features of a culture of inquiry: widespread sharing and easy access to user-friendly information on student outcomes. Sandy made this point yesterday. He talked about CEOs having dashboards, CIOs having dashboards. Where are the dashboards for the practitioners, right? The faculty and staff. I will tell you this about dashboards. My last 4 years in industry, part of what we did is help companies put in dashboards. Everyone in the late 90s wanted a dashboard. And so the thing about dashboards is, and as a social psychologist, I was the guy, and that was the younger guy in the back of the room going, what are they going to do with the dashboards? What's going to change after they had the dashboards? And not surprisingly, they told me to shut up. And when we looked at what happened after we put in dashboards, before you put in the dashboard, there were 100 people in the room, 5 of whom had the access to the data. So the idea of the dashboard is that we'd put the dashboard in and more people would have access to the data. What we found often happened is after we put in the dashboard, those same 5 people had access to the data, but it was graphical now. The other 95 still didn't look at the data. And the reason for that is we didn't change the business case or the strategy of why anyone would actually look at that data. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with dashboards. What it means is that you can't just rely on having the access to the evidence. You have to think about where are we going to create the time and space to actually explore that evidence, and the need, by the way, the demand by having the right evidence. And so I know that we talked about this in the data initiative that Bill referred to, and I think you guys are on a path to be putting that evidence in front of folks, but in the end, it's only going to work if the colleges and the leadership of the colleges and the practitioners think of ways to use the evidence, right? And I bring that back to the type of questions we ask. So encouraging people, wow, it's like I knew my own next bullet. Encouraging more people to ask a wider collection of questions. And so one of the things a number of people have talked about, Tony Bright from the Carnegie Foundation probably most notably said, we too often focus on the answer and less on the question that we're asking. That's a pretty powerful statement when you think about it. We all have data, we're awash in data. If I was to ask you right now, do you have access to enough data on your campus? Most of you would say we have access to too much data. The data is overwhelming. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know the differences between what's important and what's not important. It's used for different purposes. There's not a problem with data availability anymore. It's about what we do with that data and the type of questions that we ask with it. So the notion that we need to have these shared, reflective, and dynamic discussions, that's what Sandy was talking about yesterday. You know what the other thing they do at Valencia that's really interesting in the Aspen Prize? He didn't talk about this. Is all entering full-time faculty at Valencia, when they get there, do an action research project on some aspect of student success. Every entering faculty member takes some piece of it. And it, by the way, goes back into the interview process where they already start talking about this. They all do an action research project. And that sounds trivial for a second until you think about the culture that A, would support that, and B, that creates. So they now have, every year, a new group of people looking at a new piece of student success. And the other thing they do is they create the time and space for those people to share what they've learned with their colleagues. It's the other thing Sandy was getting at yesterday. The factory model, the efficiency model, does not build in this time to share and reflect on what we've learned. You know, the four walls of the classroom being incredibly confining is even more so when you think about when was the last time you talked with your peers about something they learned in their classroom. If it happens as a one-off. It doesn't happen as something we structurally do. The idea of multiple opportunities to discuss information within and across constituent groups. I'll have an example of this one in a minute. Continuous feedback. We too often look at things like completion rates, which, by the way, are usually 6-year outcomes. We have to wait 6 years to get good data on completion. So one of the things I'll show you later is some of the intermediate milestones we might be able to use. And then a culture. That's the other thing you get at the Valencias, and other colleges have built this. The culture that values the curiosity and has robust conversations about the questions. We can build this. It's a matter of just changing the type of questions that we ask. So developed within the completion by design, you need a framework if you're going to be a technical assistance provider or a consultant. So we have I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details of this. This doesn't look much different from what you would see with any accreditation. The idea that we're going to explore how to improve outcomes. We're going to gather meaningful evidence. Come back to that. Stage 3 is the big one. Discuss evidence broadly. When do we actually sit down and get a chance to explore data? 4, use evidence to inform change. We can sit around and talk about it all day. At some point, we have to try something different. So there's a culture of experimentation that we're talking about. And finally, measuring the impact stage. We're going to go through some examples of each of these. So the first one, explore how to improve student outcomes. So we focus our inquiry on designing approaches that improve student outcomes. Let me ask you this. What types of questions do we spend most of our organizational resources answering? Well, as you heard yesterday from Sandy, and having been in IR now around it for 12 years, I can tell you, whether it's IR or others, it's questions about productivity, enrollment, efficiency, how many butts are there in seats, classroom usage scenarios. We spend a lot of time analyzing this. Now, more recently, this has changed. We start seeing more questions about student outcomes. But it is not a trivial thing that this says actually to focus on student outcomes, right? The rest of it is the cost of doing business at the colleges, what we have to do to keep the colleges running and running more efficiently, and it's incredibly important work. But if we spend all of our time gathering data for that purpose, we're not spending a whole lot of time gathering it to improve outcomes. And then there's a second question. And in smaller rooms, I usually ask everyone to close their eyes so they're not, so we can actually have something of a silent survey. But when was the last time you sat in a standing committee meeting where you actually used evidence to discuss a key student outcome for more than 20 minutes? When was the last time that happened to you guys? Has that happened in the last 6 months, by a show of hands? Where you actually sat in a meeting that was a standard meeting on campus and discussed a key outcome for student success for more than 20 minutes? How many hands? Got a couple? That's about the normal percentage I see, and it's 8:30, so there's probably a couple more who just didn't want to raise their hands. But it's not the course of business. This is Sandy's point from yesterday, that we have let, and it's not that this is not something we've done wrong, it's just the way it's worked over time. We have let that become the exception rather than the rule. And so one question I would pose is, how do we expect to get better at this? if we don't actually take the time and space to explore these issues. Right? These problems aren't going to solve themselves. And as Sandy said yesterday, and something that we talk about a lot, we know exactly what's going to happen if we keep changing things on the margins. We have a history of innovation, by the way, in our system. The problem with that innovation is we don't have a history of innovation at scale. We've done a lot of things on the margins. We've done a lot of things with 30 and 40 students in colleges that have 6,000 and 10,000 students. And those overall changes we're hoping to make aren't going to happen unless we make bigger structural changes. And we'll come back to that at the end too. But the key of this stage, by the way, again, we're actually focusing on how to improve student outcomes. So the second one, gather meaningful evidence. Right? So meaningful is a key piece to this. We're actually going to focus on the questions here. The idea that meaningful evidence is going to be different for different groups of people. For general education faculty, for career technical faculty, for student services professionals, what is meaningful evidence is going to be different to different people. This is something we talked about in the data initiative, is you have to make sure that the evidence you're providing is useful to folks and provides them meaning. And so I think a lot of this is about the questions we asked. And so I'm now going to show you a slide that has the 20-year history of student success rates at the course level in California. And I want you to give me an initial reaction to this. So this is a 20-year history of course success rates. So what's happened to the success rate in the last 20 years in California? Absolutely nothing, right? It stayed amazingly constant. By the way, is this a good thing or a bad thing? You can actually formulate it either way. Like I could say this is a good thing because, you know, all that's changed in the last 20 years, if you believe the widely held hypothesis that our students are less qualified than they were 20 years ago, this might be a good thing. By the way, there's almost no data to support that. Those colleges who actually have data that's 20 years old will tell you that their placement rates into Dev Ed were the same 20 years ago as they are today. Right? And so this problem has now come to the surface. This issue of less qualified students is a fascinating one we've let become part of our psyche. In fact, I was at a presentation last week where a gentleman in California was pointing, at no point in history have high school graduation rates been as high as they are today. They are at the highest point in history. Though there's a standardized exam that's used to test the readiness of high school seniors, it's also at its highest point in history. And somehow we've let come into our ethos that our students are less qualified than they were 20 and 40 years ago, which I got to tell you, sounds a lot like code to me when we say our students are less qualified than they were 40 years ago. And it's code for we like the students we had 40 years ago better than the students we have now, which scares me a little bit. It does scare me a little bit. And the mission of community colleges, it's opened up higher education for a group of students that was really underserved before the 50s. I'm going to come back to that issue too that Sandy also talked about yesterday of who we're serving now versus who we served in the past, and how the structures we have may have worked very well in 1780 Oxford, but they don't work as well in the reality of a 21st century college. So the point of this slide, by the way, what's the single measure we see most in community colleges to measure success? Course success rates, right? They're amazingly stable over time, 20 years. By the way, retention, retention is a California term that means unlike in the other 49 states where Sandy was talking about yesterday, retention and persistence are used interchangeably. Retention in California, we actually have this measure. It's a statewide measure that is basically, did we not kill the student during the semester? We have a measure that says if they're still there at the end, even if they fail, we measure this as retention. The idea being, it's based in some logic of yesterday what Sandy was talking about, the role of the W grade, right? How pervasive that's become in our culture. So we actually measure it. It's kind of a silly term for it, but I would agree yesterday the idea of persistence is powerfully important. But yeah, these success rates have been in the 70s for 20 years. So how useful is course success rate as a metric? I think the data would suggest it's not all that useful, partially because it focuses on one slice in time. And to the student, the chaotic pathway, every student is on their own unique trajectory, but most of our data points take snapshots of that student. Sandy told you yesterday about the multiplicative nature of lack of success with those first 5 courses. We've done similar stuff in California with really long Dev Ed sequences. when you go down 3 levels in Dev Ed, and you guys as a system are already working on this with the modularization, which I applaud. When you went down 3 levels in math, you would find that only about 6 to 10% of students ever made it to the transfer level math course. And by the way, that number is incredibly consistent, not just in California, but nationally. Part of it speaks to the structure. Part of it just speaks to the fact when you have 4 levels to get through, and you have attrition and success rates, there's just a multiplicative effect of all those that get you down around 10%, right? And so one of the things we're starting to do now is look at more measures that cross the student experience. At the very least, cross multiple courses. And so what I'm going to give you an example of is one of these studies. I do this thing called 3 studies to energize a campus conversation about student success. We're going to use 2 of them in here. And the one we're going to use at this point focuses on this middle one, grades and success in sequenced courses. So I use this as an example of when we talk about meaningful evidence, stuff that will actually change a conversation. It's about the question we ask, right? So the question here is, this grades and sequenced courses study is what happens when a student moves on in a sequence of courses. So in a structured sequence. So where do we see this most? We see it in math. We see it in Dev Ed Math, Dev Ed English, but we also see it in the sciences, where someone's moving from course A to course B in the same sequence. And so one of the questions we can ask is, how do students do when they move forward based on their grade in the previous course, right? So the classic example of this would be, we're moving from basic math to beginning algebra. What happens to those students who get an A versus a B versus a C in basic math when they go on? Now, of course, we would suspect that the A students are going to do better, the B students are going to do a little less well, and the C students will do less well. But when you look at the data, you find something that's really powerful and fascinating. So let's take a look at this first one. Basic Math Introductory Algebra. So this is Math 300 is the 3rd level below math course in this system. And now they're moving into introductory algebra. So here's the success rates of A, B, and C students. Think about that for a second. These are students we've said to, you've passed our course. You're ready for the next course. You got a C, yes, but you're ready for the next course. 28% of those students are successful in the next course. 72% are unsuccessful. And the B students, by the way, who we think we're doing pretty well, 50% of them still are unsuccessful at the next course. A students do really well, by the way. They do better than those who place in there directly. But one of the things about this is that this is partially about how we use information, but this is, by the way, everyone looks at this slide and thinks that's not true at my school. I've now done this at 12 schools in 3 states. It's true, it's to varying degrees at every school I've looked at. And it's not, by the way, just about math. We'll show you some other sequences. Introductory to beginning algebra. This one, by the way, is slightly more of a problem because there's more students in this part of the sequence. That 3 levels below is not one of our most over-enrolled courses, but you start getting to introductory to beginning algebra or beginning to intermediate, you're seeing a lot of students. Now, by the way, one of these things calls for, after a lot of discussion and exploration, one of the solutions that's proposed for this, of course, is modularization, right, where you guys are already moving towards. Because the idea is when you have a mastery-based model, folks are actually getting more mastery of the things maybe to the 90% level before they move on. And so that's one thing you guys are already working on, which I think you will find, by the way, the places who've done modularization early on find, not necessarily in the first year, by the way, that there are vast numbers of students more getting through than were before. It's close to even until you kind of learn the system a little better, then that goes up. But what you do find in these modularizations is those who get through have incredibly higher rates of success when they move forward into the statistics or into the transfer level math course. So I'm guessing that's what you will find as well. You will also find over time, most likely, that you will also get more students through. But the first thing that almost happens all the time in these models is when the students do get through, they are much stronger and much ready for the next course. So other things, it's not just math. This is intermediate algebra to statistics. You can see the same, similar. Now we're in Dev Ed English, and overall the success rates are higher in Dev Ed English, but you see the same effect. Here's 50% of the students who got a C in English, which, although foundational, is not really foundational to the same level of math in terms of the things building on each other, but it's clearly foundational enough. Students are still 50% C rates. 50% of the C students are still failing when they move on. It goes up a little when you go to 1 level below transfer to transfer, but again, 50% of those C students. So one of my math faculty, when I did this originally at Foothill, well, almost 10 years ago now, titled this study for me as C grade's the worst possible outcome a student can get. because we're telling them you can go on in the sequence, and they're set up for failure. You might say, by the way, this is okay, because once they fail that next course the first time, they'll be more successful the second time. Ever looked at those data on what happens when students repeat? There's this idea we have that repeating students have higher success rates because it's their second time through. Quite the opposite. Most repeat rates in Dev Ed, Math, and English hover in the 40s for the repeaters. And so we're setting students up for a system where they don't necessarily get it the second time either. So that's another interesting sidelight of this. It's not just about English and math, by the way. We go over into the sciences, we find the same thing. Overall, by the way, success rates are higher in the sciences in many courses, but if you go to anatomy and physiology, you'll find something very similar. And these are college-level anatomy and physiology courses, by the way. Get a C in the first one, 43% are unsuccessful in the second one. Go in, by the way, there's even a stronger one, and it's here. Chemistry, those chemistry instructors in the room will be nodding their heads on this one. You get a C in the first quarter chemistry, you're significantly at risk for the second quarter. 2/3 of chemistry students. Again, this is not Dev Ed anymore. You can't place this at the feet of the fact they're not underqualified students. This is now in the heart of the science curriculum, right? Get a C in the first level course. And by the way, this slide is why I'm not a doctor right now. This exact thing happened to me. I got a C in the first course, didn't quite make it in the second course, and for better or for worse, I'm here today. Not operating on people, which maybe is a good thing. So the idea, again, and the point of this, there's a couple points to these slides. One is these questions we ask are very different under a model where we're focused on student progression and we're focused on having meaningful evidence about what happens to students over time. There's a whole separate conversation here about what do we do with this data. And when you talk about being more intentional toward managing student success and student progress on a trajectory, do we know who these students are when they enroll for the next course, by the way? Absolutely we do. Once the semester is over, we have the grade distribution. If you think about managing information in more of an industry way, we could consider doing something for those students who have the C when they enroll in the next course. So we could fix this issue at we could try to fix this issue at a number of levels, right? One is, let's think about aligning the curriculum between the two courses, aligning the exit standards. You know, by the way, if you ask a room full of faculty why this happens, you'll get a lot of interesting answers on the C students. One of them is kind of the social passing answer. Or repeatability rules or financial aid rules make us think that we're helping students out when they get that C. Maybe not. We've just passed the problem downstream. And so if you think about what we could do, you could think of a world, by the way, where when a student enrolled for Organic Chemistry 2 and we checked automatically their transcript and it saw that they had a C in Organic Chemistry 1, we could trigger a number of actions that happen then. You know, the smallest touch of which could be, how about we tell them about the services that are available to them and say, look, you got a C in this course, you want to make sure you're set up for success in the next course. That's kind of the low touch. The high touch is we can enroll them in a one-unit supplemental course that says, hey, congratulations, you've been selected for this one-unit student success course when you go into General Chemistry, Organic Chemistry 2. And this is the power of using information about students to set up what I would call business rules, but they're to set up strategies. We're going to talk about this a little when I get to the completion by design principles. But how do we use the information we already have about students? We have a lot of information about students, by the way. Sandy was talking about it again yesterday, those first 5 courses. Incredibly predictive of what happens after that. So part of the story, which is where Sandy attacks it, is let's work on getting those first 5 courses, getting students successful in them. You know, a secondary thing to work on is once we've recognized that fact, what do we do for students who are in the 3 out of 5 or 2 out of 5? Essentially, we do nothing and they leave, right? Our student services, and again, I've had student services report to me under various roles as well. This is not the fault of student services, but they're not set up to manage the student experience. Mostly it's when people raise their hands and say, I need help. So who tends to do that, by the way? Ever done the analysis of who actually uses student services at most of our campuses? We had swipe cards at one of my colleges in California they were testing back in the 2000s, so we had this data. And we found something really interesting. We found that we helped the people in the top 5% and the bottom 5%. And we did almost nothing for the ones in the middle, right? So we were great at helping A- students become A students. Most of our services were actually set up to do that, or help people when they were on their way out. But that middle, The middle majority is one of my colleagues called it. We don't have most of our services set up to help that group. And by the way, if you ever want to move completion rates, that's the group that's going to most move it, is the middle majority. Too many of our things are set up to catch people on the ends of the spectrum. By the way, both of which are valuable things to do, but in the world of shrinking resources, we might think about how we're going to set up the things for the middle of the population. And I think, by the way, this data calls out some of that. Physics, you see, again, a strong relationship, although physics, they get to university physics 2 with an A or B, they have pretty high success rates. So another point on this idea of gathering meaningful evidence is when we actually try interventions, for example, we'll take the learning community. What do we do when we try to evaluate on our own campuses what the success rates of these learning communities are? We tend to do something like you see in the lower left here. We take a look at a control group, we look at the success of a learning community, and then we also do something that I fondly term death by pilot, which is we give someone who has an idea a limited amount of resources, a limited amount of time, 30 students, and say, let's see how the data looks in a year, not letting us learn from any of it, not letting it be formative. This is a little less of a problem now than it was 10 years ago. But if you were to do that here, what we would see is something like this chart in the lower left-hand corner, which summarizes what happened when we did the learning community. So, you know, the success rate was 76% in the reference group, it's 78% in the learning community. Not much of a difference, right? We might conclude, is it really worth doing this learning community? So that's, you know, it's the way most of us have been looking at this data historically, but one might argue it's missing a lot of the nuance of what's really going on in the learning community. To those on the ground, the learning community is a lot more complex than just learning community. It's made up of a core of about 10 or 12 different things that form the basis for the learning community. So the idea here is that if we actually took the time to look deeper into what was making the learning community tick, we might find some really interesting things. We might find, by the way, that if you see the yellow buttons, bubbles are the ones that are going really well, the red ones are going okay, and the blue ones are kind of weak if we evaluate them. We've lost all that when we're back up here. Sorry, when we're back up here. We've lost that when we just have it be 78 versus 76. To those on the ground, to those implementing the learning community, this is the stuff that matters. And we very rarely take the time to go down to that level and look at the data. It's important for a number of reasons, by the way. It's important to explain what's going on in a 78 versus 76 model. It's also important because when we pilot costly models, we're often looking for the features of that model that we can scale. Right? And so we might find, by the way, if we did this type of analysis, that there are features underneath the overall learning community effect that are scalable. And so I'm going to ask you a question now. There's some of you who already know the answer to this from the Completion by Design world. If you look at completion rates for first-time entering freshmen on a community college campuses, you'll find at many campuses, if you take the liberal denominator of people who show up in the first term, haven't been anywhere else in college, you'll find completion rates hover in the teens and 20s. Right? A lot of the national debate will say community college completion rates are in the 20s, and this is what the accountability systems are trying to change. Can you think of any groups on your campus that have a success rate that's much higher than that? Often double, sometimes triple the completion rate of the all first-time group. And so normally I would pause for a lot. But the answers you'll often get are international students or ESL students or returning students, by the way, all of whom have slightly higher success rates. But there's one group on nearly every community college I've ever seen that has success rates that are in the 60s, sometimes in the 70s. And that group is athletes. Athletes. I know I'm in North Carolina where there's a bit of a scandal going on right now at the four-year schools. It's different in the community colleges. There are very few community college coaches whose jobs are won or lost based on their record. Community college coaches are much more interested in getting their students an education. And what you find, by the way, when you look at the data, is to do this on your campus sometime. Take the entering first-time freshman athletes. You'll find the success rates in the 60s and 70s. Why is that, by the way? What is it about that athlete? And by the way, is that a more qualified group academically than average? Quite the opposite, usually. It's less qualified. So why do they do so much better? Well, the answers you'll commonly hear is, well, they have a coach invested in their success. I rename coach institutional agent, invested in their success. They've got someone, very pithy, I know, it plays well. They've got someone invested in their success. They have a coach. Well, they also have structure, right? They also have a ticking time clock. Day one you start playing, you only got 5 years. You can't take 5 years in community colleges, right? So you have motivation. You also have a team invested in your success. You have peers, right? If you're the starting quarterback, everyone else on the team except for one person, the backup quarterback, is invested in your succeeding in your program because the team wants to win. Other things you have is you don't just have tutoring, you have structured tutoring. You have dedicated, and by the way, this is not to minimize the relationship occasionally between athletes and faculty. That thing can be challenging. It's not to minimize that. But in the face of all that, you have a group of students who, by the way, many of whom would not be in college if it weren't for athletics. We had this discussion in California recently as they tried to get rid of athletics at the state level. And some people showed them some of the data on what would happen to diversity at a couple of the colleges in the state, and it would go away at a couple of the smaller colleges. But these are groups of students who often wouldn't come to college otherwise, who come and get 60 to 70% completion rates. Seems like we're doing a pretty good job. The point of this, by the way, is not to do for everyone what we do for athletes, but maybe get closer to it. You think about the things that are in there. There's structure. There's structured support. It's not raise your hand support. And if you say, if I want to go to student services now, it's built in. It's built into the model, right? So it's, again, that sets up one of the design principles for completion by design. So now a second one, the idea of discussing evidence broadly. So this is the notion of, this is what I see as the critical piece of this, which is really exploring the data. I could hand a table of data to everyone in this room and I would get somewhere about 1,000 different interpretations of what that data meant and what we should do about it. And right now on most of our campuses, A, that doesn't happen. You don't get the table. B, the thing that rarely happens is you have the time and space to sit with your peers and say, what do you think's going on here? And what might we do about it? Like that time and space, the data initiative, all the data that's come down on the system in the last 10 years, we've left out that key piece, which is where do we find the time and space to explore? And that's, by the way, what Valencia did. That's where, you heard it yesterday from Sandy. They sat down and they took the time to really analyze, and this is not a data exercise. It's about the questions you ask and the conversations that come out of looking at the data. Data can help be a catalyst, but it's never going to drive the conversation. It has to be there in support of these types of questions we're asking that are a little bit differently. So we're going to give you an example of data not speaking for themselves. The idea here is that we need this time and space to discuss and analyze. And I'm going to give you an example of some data from California. Now, I know we're in a state here in North Carolina that has pretty strong prerequisites. In our completion by design work with some of the schools, the idea, one of the things that's a challenge, by the way, is getting students interested in college when we force them to do the same things they were very unsuccessful at in high school, and we do it in a way that doesn't contextualize it to anything they're interested in, right? So that there's a lot of data on why would we expect students to become excited about college when we're forcing them to do exactly the things that were identified as problems for them in high school. But what's interesting about this, there are many states across the union that don't have strong prerequisites. So what happens a lot in these states is this question gets asked, how do students do who are at varying levels of dev ed when they go into these GE courses in other areas? And so we do some research on this, and we take a look at this. And the point of these slides is that when we just stop at the first interpretation and not ask deeper questions, we may go down a path that gets us in trouble. And so let's take a look at, now I used to teach psych, so we'll use Psych 101, which is the introductory psych course. It's a survey course. And now we're going to look at the success rates in Psych 101 for students at varying levels of English. And so these are, by the way, English 826 is 2 levels below college, 836 is 1 below, English 100 is kind of the 1A transfer level course, 110 is the 1B. So what happens when we look at students who are in Psych 100? And by the way, those IR folks in the room will know that the placement database is by far the messiest on any community college campus. It's the hardest. It overwrites itself all the time. So the way I do this research is I look for students who are simultaneously enrolled. Because we have a bunch of students taking the GE courses because we don't have strong prerequisites. I can then go in and look at, hey, are there any of them taking English in the same semester or a quarter? And by the way, you find that about 1/3 of them, this is what this left side of the bar shows, 1/3 of students in Psych 101 are in an English course in that semester. So this way I know exactly what level they're at because they're in that course. And so when you look at the success rates, you see something that you might expect. If you look at the 4 levels of English and the success rates in psychology, you see, wow, students who are, there aren't many students, by the way, in 826, 2 levels below, but they have very low success rates when they're in Psych 100, down in the 30% range. 836, much bigger group, one level below, have a 48% success rate, still pretty low. You jump up to 100 and 110, the success rate jumps to 68 and 75%. So as a reasonable hypothesis about what we should do about this, you ask, well, maybe we need a prerequisite, right? It's a very reasonable conclusion. If you just look at this slide, the easy answer would be we should probably have a prerequisite of eligibility for English 100 as a prerequisite for Psych 101. Perfectly reasonable conclusion. So I'm in a room of about 125 people about 5 years ago when I first did this study. Cross-functional group, exploring student success, doing that thing I was talking about earlier, actually sitting down, taking the time to think about data like this and the results. And a woman in the back raises her hand, and I have to say I was already ready with these slides, and I would have planted the question if she didn't ask it, but she did. She raised her hand and said, what happens when you look at math level with Psych 100? What happens when you look at math level? I said, that's a very good question. I happen to have it on the next slide. And what happens when you look at math level and Psych 100? By the way, for the Psych 100 instructors, is there any math in Psych 100? It's not a methods course, by the way. We can go down the path of there's analytical reasoning, but for the most part, this is a survey course, right? There's 15 chapters. I'm sure none of you teach it this way, but it's often, here's a chapter, here's a week, read the chapter, there's a quiz, there's a test, 4-way, it's gotten better, but that's basically what Psych 100 is. It's a survey course. There's no math in Psych 100. So what happens when we look at math and Psych 100? That look familiar? It's almost exactly the same relationship that you see for English. Had I shown this slide first and asked the question, what should we do about it now? We might say, we need a math prerequisite for Psych 100. Which, by the way, this slide is suggesting would work. From the standpoint of, are we going to have higher success rates in Psych 100? Yeah, absolutely you'll have higher success rates, but why? Why do we have higher success rates in Psych 100? So now we have the situation where both English and math level predict success in Psych 100. So, by the way, when I did this the first time, you will get one person in the room to say, when seeing both of these slides, yeah, we still need a prerequisite of math, which I don't know is a conclusion that many of us would reach here. What might be some of the other reasons? Think about what the other reasons might be that describe the combination of these two effects. And so what we get are things like study skills, just general ability to navigate college. The fact that getting grades in one course breeds getting grades in a different course. There's the idea of motivation, of non-cognitive things like social capital, confidence. Lots of great research on this, by the way, coming out right now. The non-cognitive factors that are related to success in community colleges, these are amazingly strong effects. And actually, it could be explaining what's going on here. So, by the way, the point of these two slides are not that we shouldn't have prerequisites. Because as these slides are showing you, they will work. You'll have higher success rates. But they may work for a reason we didn't quite intend. We're using them as proxies. They're clearly proxies for something. Right, because we know it's not about math ability in Psych 100, so that's a proxy for something. And the problem with that leaves us with is we're not addressing whatever the issue is that it's a proxy for. Through math and English, and by the way, another thing you'll get to describe this data is it's actually a survival analysis. When our dev ed sequences were so long, anyone who actually made it through them was a survivor, they'll have higher success rates, right? So we've let math and English become the arbiter of entry into transfer level courses, right? And if you look at the data will tell you that, yeah, students who are a couple levels below won't do as well in those courses. But again, are we really addressing the issues by only attacking math and English? Different set of questions. And just to make the point further, by the way, if you look at, it's not just Psych 1. I did it for 10 other GE courses, and you see versions of the same relationship. Varies, and this is one college, so individual difficulty of courses is going to vary. But you see roughly the same thing in these 10 courses. And then I stop on this last slide when I have more time, and I pause and ask if anyone notices anything interesting about this particular slide. So give it about 10 seconds. See if you notice anything interesting about this one. Anything interesting about the courses that are listed there? One of them maybe kind of interesting. How about that Fitness 334 course? What do we see, by the way, in the relationship for Fitness 334? we see the same exact relationship. So think in your heads for a second. This is a Northern California college. Think of the most stereotypical Northern California fitness course. I get two answers when I ask this. What are they? Surfing and yoga. Those are the two answers I get. Well done on the Northern California stereotypes. And you are right, by the way, and that this course is actually yoga. Not theories of yoga, not history of yoga from 1220 to 1240. It's an activity-based yoga course, right? So the relationship is the same in an activity-based yoga course as it is in the GE courses, in the social sciences and humanities. Is it about English and math here? We're saying it's about English and math for an activity-based yoga course. Something else is going on here, and we've left what's going on the table for 50 years, right? Whether or not you have strong prerequisites, we've left what might be, and I don't know the answer, by the way, what the real issue is, partially because we haven't asked that type of question. We spend our time, if we ever ask this type of question, which is already a step forward from where we've been, we stop at the simple answer and don't ask about the underlying issues or explore them, by the way. The point of this is not that someone should have the answer to what to do here. The point is we need to think differently about the questions we're asking. And don't stop when we see that first answer. And so, by the way, stage 4, which we're going to get to in a second, is to not get paralyzed by analysis. We don't want to get paralyzed. We have to act at some point, right? But the point of these is we do need to do a little bit of exploration and discussion about what's actually going on the ground level. And so stage 4, using evidence to inform change. I'm going to skip forward a little bit in this, but the idea here is that we're not seeking absolute truths here. We're not looking for the answer, because frankly, we're unlikely to find it. What we're looking for is a pattern that may lead us in the right direction, right? And this bottom bullet's really important. If you're in a culture where failure is viewed as failure, this culture of inquiry is never going to fly because no one's ever going to want to try anything, right? This idea that we can actually learn from things that don't go well if we take the time to actually explore the data and really wrestle with it is a feature of this culture. And so this is, I think, a visual that helps a little with this. What do we do when the evidence is ambiguous? So the process of inquiry is in no way a search for absolute truth. Before we start, it might be that our domain of possible solutions is what you see in the big bubble. There's about 100 things that are going on there. And what we do through research and analysis and inquiry is we eliminate successively some dead-end solutions where we now are down to a smaller window. This is more what research does in our world. It almost never, by the way, the C grade is one of the few examples of where I think the data almost calls for an answer. But most of the time, it brings us down to a limited set of things we can do. And at some point, we have to actually just trust our expertise and choose. This was what's been missing, by the way, from all this focus on data in the last 10 or 15 years, is actually integrating it and marrying it with the deep subject matter expertise of everyone in this room. The data exists here, the expertise exists here, they don't meet. There's really there's no structural place where that would happen. But the idea, and one of the things I love about completion by design, which could be another keynote, is the idea that it's not saying you shall do A, B, C, and D. It gives you a series of design principles that I'll close with and says, you know your culture. You know where you are on this trajectory. How would you implement strategies based on these design principles? It's a very different mindset than the old mindset of initiatives would say, we'll give you money to do these 3 things. Let us know how it goes. What I like about this project is it's very different. It says, we will give you some money to seed your thinking on this and give you some design principles and expertise, and you get to choose at the end. But the bottom line here is at some point you have to try something and see how it goes, right? So I'm going to flip forward. Okay, this is the seizure-inducing piece of the presentation. I've never once, by the way, finished all of the slides in a presentation of mine. So I rarely try to. So here's what we're going to end with. We've got about 5 minutes here. Here are the design principles. So the point, why do I have these here? It's because of the using the evidence to inform change. So the idea here is you look, and by the way, another thing we don't often do at community colleges is look at the national research. You guys do a better job of that, I got to tell you, in North Carolina than some others, integrating the national research from folks like CCRC and WestEd and MDRC, the folks who are doing big national evaluation projects and research projects. But at the end of these kind of research projects, we don't often coalesce what we found into what I would call design principles. And so in completion by design, we did that. We looked at the national research really strongly, mainly based on the CCRC work. and with strategy seeded by the Gates Foundation, came up with these 8 principles. 1, accelerate entry into coherent programs of study. The idea that structure matters. Structure matters. By the way, you do focus groups with students? This whole idea that students need to find themselves in the college world, that's the idea that worked really well in 1780 at Oxford, by the way, where every student was rich, they were all from the ruling class, it didn't matter what they did in college, they were going to be successful no matter what. Fast forward to the 1950s in the US, I don't think the world was all that much different, right? If you went to college, it didn't matter what your degree was in, you were going to be successful. So democratize education, move forward to the 21st century, and it's no longer the case that you can just go to college, find yourself, and get some degree, right? It's become a different ballgame now, right? So we may need to change the way we think about this a little. If you talk to students, you do focus groups with students, they tell you something very interesting. They tell you, we want more structure, not less. We want you to tell us what we need to do to get to where we want to go. Direct quote. They're not asking for a lack of structure. They're asking for more structure. Why does it work for athletes? Why does it work, by the way, where do we have structure right now? We have it in allied health. We also have incredibly high success rates in allied health. We also, yes, some of the students may be more qualified there, but we have incredibly high success rates. How many 13-year-olds do you think are out there sitting there in freshman year of high school right now saying, you know what I want to be when I grow up? I want to be a phlebotomist. I want to draw blood when I grow up. I would guess none of them are actually thinking that. And you might be worried if they were, different issue. But why are people so interested in phlebotomy programs when they get older? Because there's a job on the other end, that's one reason. But the other reason is because they know what it takes to get there. They know already what they're going to need to do to get there. So that structure, and by the way, so part of what CBD is about is this idea of not going all the way from the allied health structure over to bring gen ed all the way over there. There's stages along a pathway here. There's stages in the middle where we're providing some structure. And by the way, this is not a community college only thing. One of the things when we talk more about this idea that comes up is we're trying to make the community colleges more like technical schools. That's not what we want to do. And by the way, I wouldn't think in some ways that would be a bad thing. But it's interesting, there are 4-year schools now. This is really like emerging every day that are really focused on this idea of getting students more focused early. Arizona State, Florida State, not small schools, huge schools, who are having these ideas of concentrations or community of interest or pre-majors with more structure to help students navigate their institutions. It's not just about community colleges. So this idea of getting people into programs of study, ensure students know the requirements to succeed. Well, that's not a small one, right? Do they actually know what they need to do to get there? Where do they find that information right now? In a 750-page catalog that's got 200 majors that all appear to be equal, when in fact 90% of our students are in 5 majors on most of our campuses, right? But we've got all 300 in the catalog. We give them no guidance, well, essentially none, aside from potentially a counseling visit for 20 minutes up front. We haven't set the system up to guide students to make that choice. We shouldn't be surprised so many students are undecided. We haven't helped them decide. We've really done nothing on that, aside from osmosis, to help them make a decision about this. A third one, minimize time required to get college ready. You guys are really working on this already with your modularization. Customizing and contextualizing instruction, the point from earlier. There are very few students who are excited about Dev Ed, Math, and English, right? This is not why they came to college. Now, it doesn't mean it's not important, but it's not why they came to college. So it's interesting when you look at the models, by the way, of contextualized Dev Ed, you also find higher success rates, bigger structural change. Integrating student support with instruction. We've talked about this one for, what, 30 years now? Where do we see examples of that? Interestingly, we see examples of that, hey, in allied health, where you have a program director who's kind of enveloping the services around the curriculum, and with athletes, interestingly, higher success rates there. Also, by the way, with some veterans programs, do a really good job with this. Higher structure, more integration, we see higher success rates. This 6th one is the one I'm going to kind of close with focusing on, this idea of continually monitoring progress and proactively providing feedback. We are at the current moment are the only 2 times we communicate progress to students in their pathway. Graduation, and if they go on probation, are the only 2 times we ever communicate anything about progress. You might say grades. Grades communicate what happened in a course. They don't communicate anything about progress toward the degree. And there are a lot of things that are examples of this. One of them, by the way, is the C-grade study. where we could actually use that information. Another one is our colleagues in Ohio has a program that when students register for courses, and they register for a course off of their program pathway, pops up a screen that says, hey, you know you're registering for a course that's off your program pathway? Think about that for a second. A, they have to know what pathway they're on. But B, they're taking a proactive step and saying, by the way, they're not saying to them in the end, you can't register for that. They're just saying, did you know? My guess is they didn't know. And the next stage of that, by the way, which they're already working on, is you could also see it popping up the next screen, which is, and by the way, here's 4 courses you still need to fulfill, and here's sections that are open in those 4 courses. That's using information to help students monitor their progress and feedback. Another one on this, which is the 7th principle, reward behaviors that contribute to completion. This doesn't necessarily mean monetary rewards, by the way. When I was in the late 90s in industry, there was this big debate about whether you were better off giving customers a small monetary incentive, a $5 or $10 coupon, or status. The research on this is very clear. You're far better off giving them status and recognition to cement a relationship between a customer and a company. It's the same with us. When was the last time anyone said to a student, congratulations on what you've done so far? Overall, not in a course. Congratulations, you've made it you've got 30 units done with a 3.0. You're halfway there, congratulations. It would be so simple to do that, yet we never do that. Hey, congratulations, you just finished your first semester. And you got a 3.5, and you're ready to move on. That's one message. How about, wow, you just finished your first semester, we see you struggle a little bit, what can we do to help? Before it becomes probation, right? So again, this idea that we can reward and use information, and finally using technology. I would argue technology is not the answer in and of itself, but how do we use it to focus things on completion? So stage 5, measuring the impact of change. This is where we actually just make sure we look at what happened when we make the changes. So why all the fuss here? What about a culture of inquiry? One, it's because this work is challenging and necessary. And again, I come back to this idea of marrying the insight with the evidence. The deep expertise in this room and on every one of your college campuses tends to stay in the heads of everyone on those campuses and doesn't come into a broad discussion. Right? This is something we're all trying to change. These problems are large and recurring. There's no silver bullet answer here. That's why I like what CBD has gone with this. It has some principles, but it's not saying do these 4 things and you're going to have 90% success rates. Use your expertise. Marry it with the type of questions and data, and we can get somewhere with this. Valencia's story, by the way, is not about any one single thing they did, or that that's the only way to do it. With their culture and their student population, they asked a certain set of questions. They had the guts to act on what they thought were the answers to those questions, and they moved the needle forward. That process is what we're talking about, not just in do learning communities or just do X. It's about a process. And so the final thing here is that, to finish, is this idea of cross-constituent interaction is so critical to this, to get together with your peers. If you give the same data, the same results to the math department, the English department, the counseling department, and the humanities department, you're going to get 4 different interpretations of what's going on there. Right now, those interpretations aren't shared. They're often not shared within, but they're really not shared across. And so as you think about next steps, I'd argue what are some things you can do as a quick win on your campus? Those 3 studies, I shared 2 of them. The third one's about cohort tracking. The idea of putting studies like that in front of your folks to help explore them. I've offered to share the syntax I used to help create these studies. They're not that hard. Like the idea that you can use these key questions and the data to them to help move forward. And if we had more time, we'd talk about some of the challenges to this, of course, are IR capacity, or a campus culture not wanting to know the answers to these questions. There are certainly challenges to this culture. But I think combined with what you heard from Mark and Michael and Clive and Sandy, the point of this is you can do this. They did make these changes. We've seen it numerous places. And that it's so much more about the questions and the culture than it is about any feature you need to have in place to make this happen. Sandy said this yesterday too, and I couldn't agree more. I am incredibly optimistic about where we are right now. We have the chance to change things for our students. We really do. We have to make bigger changes. They can't be small changes. We have to make structural changes, not one-off changes. But we have a chance to actually learn from all that's come before us and put it in play right now with a culture that kind of supports this so we can see how it's going. And I think in 5 years, you're going to hear some pretty interesting stories, not just from CBD schools, but from all of our schools who are looking at data in a new way, asking different questions, and implementing changes that we hope are going to improve student success, and I think we're going to find that they are. So I want to thank you for your time, and also again say, you guys can do this. It's not rocket science. Like, cultural change is hard, but there's no feature missing on your campus right now that would not let you go down this path. So thank you very much for your time. Only 10